What's going on, everybody? I'm back with another video. This video is going to be looking at Antonio Conte and his tactics and if he's the problem behind Spurs. So to do this, we're going to look back at his Juve days, his Italy spell as national team manager, then when he made the move to Chelsea, and finally we're going to end with his tenure at Inter Milan, going over some tactics and the key principles over each of his teams, primarily his 5-3-2 system that was a staple through each of them. Now, before we get into that and his journey as a manager, be sure to check out the Once Video Analyzer. It's how I'm making this video. Check out both my books. They're in the description below. Links to them are in the description. And as well, check out my new tactics course. All that's in the description as well. Now, let's get right into the video with his tactics as the Juve manager. Now, when we look at his manager tenure over across different teams, it's important to note the quality of the players he had at his disposal. He may have had the best three central defenders at his Juve days in Serie A and one of the most competitive back lines in all of Europe. So when we look at this, it's important to include the context, and because he's won titles at every club he's been to, aside from the national team that they had a good run in the Euros, but every club he's been to, he's won league titles. And the players deserve a lot of credit for that because he's had some truly exceptional teams. But the 5-3-2 has been a staple and seemed to get the most out of them. And now we can look at why this was so effective. So typically they played with a +1 superiority, at least with central defenders around the number 9. This would give the center back, the third center back, freedom to jump between the lines to control this space. So they became very hard to break down in a low block, and with two central forwards, they had targets to link up with in the offensive transition, with players like Pogba, Arturo Vidal, and Andrea Pirlo playing deeper passes and containing quality to completely change the game. So as we look in possession, we'll look as his teams predominantly have played with this 3-5-2 with a single holding midfielder, especially in the Juve days. Now the 3-5-2 is very flexible and they can change their shape whether they play with 1 and 2 holding midfielders. So this adaptability is also something that's always been within Antonio Conte's teams. Now we always have to think back on how this would relate to Spurs. So they don't have an Andrea Pirlo in this Spurs team, and the quality of the players is arguably less in his Tottenham Hotspur team than it has been with Juve, Chelsea, or even Inter Milan, it could be argued. But now when we look at the Juve tactics, Andrea Pirlo dropping the ball deep outside of the first line of pressure and creating a diamond in the first line. Now Pirlo's qualities allowed him to break many rules as a holding midfielder positionally because he had the quality to play these exceptional passes to just completely unravel a defense. But then we'll look at the wing backs going forward and progressing up the field holding width. This allowed the players to create overloads in key areas and become very hard to mark in dangerous space. So we have players between the lines on the left hand side, Pogba benefiting from these overloads and playing a very free role, so a very attacking minded player with the quality to make a difference with number 10s to link up with in close proximity. They were able to then make wide rotations with the advancing wingback, giving them some flexibility and looking to especially target the opposing team's fullbacks and create superiority against them. So their wide structure is centered around the half space, with each of their central defenders able to progress the ball through the half space, gave them a lot of progressive connections in these dangerous areas. Now we'll see the build-up diamond again from this Juve side and actually the last picture, and we'll look at some of the tactical adaptations he's went through and some of the problems early on. So we do see this side get a little bit one-dimensional, and what I mean by this is the players in the front line, although they have pairings, sometimes they become very flat and not using the space between the line in the opposing team's block. So here we have a flat midfield with space being left between the lines, but the player is not occupying this very well and staying very close to the highest line of defense or the back line. So because of this height, they look for runs in behind, and because of the quality of the passers, they play higher up, look for runs in behind, ideally diagonally, which would then target players drifting out wide as the fullbacks we'd mentioned, or players like Arturo Vidal dropping in and fanning out into the wide areas, covering these advanced wingbacks and progressing around these central areas. So they're taking a safer route to attack the final third, but could create more dangerous chances. So now we're going to look at his Italy tenure. So again, he goes with a 5-3-2, but now his back line becomes more reserves. The central defenders can still progress the ball forward, but they don't do so quite as aggressively as they did at Juve. They also have a different quality of player in their holding midfielder, so he has to be positionally better because he doesn't possess the on-ball qualities that Andrea Pirlo did. So in these positions, he'll typically stay as the holding midfielder in behind the first line of pressure, looking to create superiority and maximize the numerical advantage that the team possesses against the front three of Spain in this picture. Now from Spain as well, with our holding midfielder, we have our 3-5-2. So we have two eights on either side, allowing them to have freedom in the half space to come deeper and look to try and manipulate usually the defensive midfielders of their opponents. So in this, they're able to displace midfielders, get them to jump, or pull them into wider areas. As we see here, the number 10 being drawn to the holding midfielder, and now what this man orientation or these specific movements creates is the opportunity for a number 10 or one of their center forwards to drop between the lines and create a 4 versus 3 to progress up the field. And with our very high wingbacks, we also have the ability for our eights to drop into wide areas and use the wide areas to simply progress around the opposing team's block. Now, a staple within the team is this back five and their aggressive central defenders able to jump between the lines and cover space. So as we see here, the left central defender jumps between the lines, closing and limiting the options these players have, all the while being connected through their very narrow central three players, limiting the entry passes they're able to create while having the cover from their central defenders, preventing any players from turning on the central corridors and facing the back five. This then limits the amount of threat the opposing team can make, and by decreasing the space, increasing the numbers around the ball, we can start to think of how we can transition into attack and get forward, while in this case Spain have created overloads with their wide structures. But now winning the ball deeper, we can then think of how to link up with our attacking players in offensive transition and play off of these players to exploit teams that overcommit offensively. And now we're going to look at Antonio Conte when he took over at Chelsea. And now we're looking at the midfield shape against Manchester United. Now, it was a very interesting takeover when he took over Spurs, because many people probably looked back at his Chelsea days to see what kind of manager Spurs were going to get. But now we see a very different approach. Now with Chelsea, again, the quality of players is arguably a little bit worse than when he was at Chelsea. With his midfield three, he had a lot of different player profiles, from Cesc Fabregas to Antonio Conte, from Cesc Fabregas to N'Golo Kante to Bakayoko, and now Eden Hazard dropping off and playing as a free roaming number 10, looking to create superiority between the lines. So in this picture, we'll see they had the most natural number 9, with Hazard playing a winger and being able to play a number 10 role. So with Morata playing as an out-and-out number 9, gave Hazard freedom to link up with his midfielders, create man advantages against two holding midfielders or two holding midfielders and a number 10, creating 4 versus 3. And in this picture, we see what it did to defenses, players forcing to follow Hazard between the lines because of his individual quality and threat, allowed Morata to be 1v1 with central defenders, which paired really well for the wide players of Chelsea and the wingbacks because they were able to advance, get into wide areas, and they'd have a target one-on-one in the penalty area to look to cross the ball into. And often progression would occur in the half spaces, with Hazard having the freedom to maneuver from the central area into either half space and change the shape of the midfield from a diamond to a box. Now we'll look at the midfield shape again, and now we'll see Hazard changing his positioning into the half space now, rather than playing as a natural number 10 in central areas, but he drops into more of an 8 position, switching with Bakayoko, allowing Hazard to get on the ball deeper and link up with his more creative midfielders. This also then further pulls the central defender out of position if he's followed, or if not, they can use the numerical advantage they have in midfield with both wingbacks advancing on and looking to match up against the fullbacks from Manchester United in this case, or other teams in the league. Now defensively, as we've mentioned, they sat a bit deeper. They could go a bit higher, push their eights further forward, and look to press teams higher up the field. But for now, we're going to look at their midfield three and their back five, a staple throughout their team, giving them a +1 numerical advantage at the back through most teams, even when they played with 2 9s or a 9 and a 10 pressing up against the back line. So giving them this numerical advantage at the back made them very difficult to play against, especially for teams that predominantly played off crosses and looked to play with 2 out and out number 9s. Also, the compactness was very frustrating to play against and often forced teams, especially more creative midfielders, to drop deeper outside the block of Chelsea, as we see here, and around just to get a touch of the ball. So by dropping these players deeper, they lost impact in key areas, especially in the half spaces where most chances are created in the Premier League, especially in modern days. So by having this 5-3-2, they secured the half space with a numerical advantage at the back and force the team to play in front of them or around, making play very predictable and allowing them to isolate the ball in wide areas and win the ball back with numbers, making their offensive transition even more effective. Now when we look at Inter, we'll look at one of the radical build-ups that took a lot of people by surprise, and this was in the Champions League against Barcelona, with asymmetry in their central defenders to create a 4-2 build-up, but the proximity that was created between central defenders and holding midfielders was very surprising. Now they played in a very progressive way with similar structural components as we've mentioned earlier, but they looked to create numerical superiority in their build-up and progress against a pressing side. So when they would create numerical advantages, here we have a 4 versus 5 in the penalty area, but now the key is the wingbacks, once pressure is created and attracted, they have progressive options through the wide area if they can't create a free man in central positions. So they always have a fail-safe for easy progression to go up the field, and the fullbacks stay narrow. They don't use a full width, putting them closer and decreasing the passing distance, also putting them closer to the central corridors of the field where they'll have their more offensive players and attacking midfielders to link up with. Now finally with Inter, they played in a more pragmatic way with often using 2 holding midfielders and 1 free roaming number 10. I apologize for the quality of the image. It was kind of hard to find older images of older games under Antonio Conte, but I did the best I could. But the flexibility of the midfield 3 allowed them to play with more 2 holding midfielders, often playing against the front 3, putting them between connections of players in this front 3, or in a 4-2-3-1, often putting them between offensive midfielders and allowing them to find numerical advantages or positional advantages to springboard their attack going forward. Then the number 10, or the player dropping deeper between the lines, was able to overload a side, find a half space, or connect diagonally to the 2 defensive midfielders. Now lastly, we'll look at their pressing at Inter Milan. They pressed with 2 number 9s looking to press very vertically with a number 10 behind them, covering their press and lining up against the holding midfielder. From here, the wingbacks would be responsible for jumping on, and the 3 central defenders underneath would be covering in behind and shifting to the ball side when the ball side was established, to then cover against a more direct route and cover the wingback. And this is where we're going to wrap up the video. Now, let me know in the comments below if you think Conte is a problem at Spurs. I personally don't. I think he should be given time and more money to spend with complete trust, even though that probably won't happen. He'll probably be sacked, but I'm also not a Spurs fan, so let me know in the comments below what you think Spurs should do with this situation on the back of that bombshell of an interview that he dropped after their match. And I'll see you in the next one.